Counter-Narrative News wanted to share Lenin's position on the Irish Easter Uprising of the Easter week in 1916, considering it's Easter weekend. I thought we'd share this very interesting historical moment. Lenin was really inspired by the Easter Uprising in Ireland because it was in the context of the First World War, which starts in 1914. And at the outset of it, Lenin argued that revolutionary socialists should use the opportunity of this global conflict between the leading colonial powers as to a spat in which they drag the entire world into a violent conflict as to who's going to have the greatest spoils of the colonies to exploit the land and the labor of the people and the planet. So considering that that was the class nature of the war, Lenin argues that turn that into a revolutionary civil war so the oppressed can attempt to take state power and enact policies around their empowerment that seeks to uplift the oppressed masses. As it happened, because of the way in which colonialism bribes and corrupts, especially the upper layer of the working class movement in trade unions and representatives in capitalist parliaments, etc., they didn't use the opportunity to conduct a radical working class civil war, but they ended up supporting their own imperialist states against other imperialist states. And Lenin denounced this as probably the most important kind of political contribution of Lenin's, and it's all related to his own attempt and successful attempt at catching state power a year after the Easter Uprising, which happened in 1916. Lenin captures state power with the Bolsheviks in November 1917. So I'm just going to quote this article by Lenin and a few discussions and comments afterwards. To quote the Irish Rebellion of 1916, our theses were written before the outbreak of this rebellion, which must be the touchstone of our theoretical views. The views of the opponents of self-determination lead to the conclusion that the vitality of small nations oppressed by imperialism has already been sapped, that they cannot play a role against imperialism, that support of their purely national aspirations will lead to nothing, etc. The imperialist war of 1914 to 16 has provided facts which refute such conclusions. The war proved to be an epoch of crisis for the West European nations and for imperialism as a whole. Every crisis discards the conventionalities, tears away the outer wrapping, sweeps away the obsolete, and reveals the underlying springs and forces. What has it revealed from the standpoint of the movement of oppressed nations? In the colonies, there have been a number of attempts at rebellion, which the oppressor nations naturally did all they could to hide by means of a military censorship. Nevertheless, it is known that in Singapore, the British brutally suppressed a mutiny among the Indian troops, that there are attempts at rebellion in the French Annam and in the German Cameroons, that in Europe, on the one hand, there was a rebellion in Ireland, which the freedom-loving English, who did not dare to expend conscription to Ireland, suppressed by executions, and on the other, the Austrian government passed the death sentence on the deputies of the Czech Diet for treason and shot whole Czech regiments for the same crime. The list is, of course, far from complete. Nevertheless, it proves that, owing to the crisis of imperialism, the flames of national revolt have flared up both in the colonies and in Europe, and that natural sympathies and antipathies have manifested themselves in spite of the draconian threats and measures of repression. All this before the crisis of imperialism hit its peak. The power of the imperialist bourgeoisie was yet to be undermined. This may be brought about by a war of attrition, but has not yet happened. And the proletarian movements in the imperialist countries were still very feeble. What will happen when the war has caused complete exhaustion, or when, in one state at least, the power of the bourgeoisie has been shaken under the blows of proletarian struggle, as that of Tsarism in 1905? On May the 9th, 1916, there appeared in Bernatagewacht, the organ of the Zimmerwald group, including some of the leftists, an article on the Irish Rebellion entitled "Their Song is Over" and signed with initials KR. It described the Irish rebellion as being nothing more nor less than a push. For, as the author argued, the Irish question was an agrarian one. The peasants had been pacified by reforms, and the nationalist movement remained only a purely urban petit bourgeois movement which, notwithstanding the sensation it caused, had not much social backing. It is not surprising that this monstrously doctrinaire and pedantic assessment coincided with that of a Russian national liberal cadet, Mr. A. Kolisha, who also labelled the rebellion the Dublin Putsch. It is to be hoped that, in accordance with the adage, it's an ill wind that blows nobody any good, many comrades who are not aware of the morass they were sinking into by repudiating self-determination and by treating the national movements of small nations with disdain, will have their eyes opened by the accidental coincidence of opinion held by a social democrat and a representative of the imperialist bourgeoisie. The term putsch, in its scientific sense, may be employed only when the attempt at insurrection has revealed nothing but a circle of conspirators or stupid maniacs and has aroused no sympathy amongst the masses. The centuries-old Irish national movement, having passed through various stages and combinations of class interests, manifested itself in particular in a mass Irish National Congress in America, which called for Irish independence. It also manifested itself in street fighting conducted by a section of the urban petty bourgeoisie and a section of the workers after a long period of mass agitation, demonstrations, suppression of newspapers, etc. Whoever calls such a rebellion a putsch is either a hardened reactionary or a doctrinaire hopelessly incapable of envisaging a social revolution as a living phenomenon. To imagine that social revolution is conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe, without revolutionary outbursts by a section of the petty bourgeoisie with all its prejudices, without a movement of the politically non-conscious proletarian and semi-proletarian masses against oppression by the landowners, the church and the monarchy against national oppression, etc. To imagine all of this is to repudiate social revolution. So one army lines up in one place and says, we are for socialism, and another somewhere else and says, we are for imperialism, and that will be a social revolution. Only those who hold such a ridiculously pedantic view could vilify the Irish rebellion by calling it a putsch. Whoever expects a pure revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. The Russian Revolution of 1905 was a bourgeois democratic revolution. It consisted of a series of battles in which all the discontented classes, groups and elements of the population participated. Among these were the masses imbued with the crudest prejudices, with the vaguest and most fantastic aims of struggle. There were small groups which accepted Japanese money, there were speculators and adventurers, etc. But objectively, the mass movement was breaking the hack of Tsarism and paving the way for democracy. For this reason, the class-conscious workers led it. The socialist revolution in Europe cannot be anything other than an outburst of mass struggle on the part of all and sundry oppressed and discontented elements. Inevitably, sections of the petty bourgeoisie and of the backward workers will participate in it. Without such participation, mass struggle is impossible. Without it, no revolution is possible. And just as inevitably, they will bring into the movement their prejudices, their reactionary fantasies, their weaknesses and errors. But objectively, they will attack capital and the class-conscious vanguard of the revolution, the advanced proletariat, in expressing the subjective truth of a variegated and discordant, motley and outwardly fragmented mass struggle will be able to unite and direct it, capture power, seize the banks, expropriate the trusts, which all hate, though for difficult reasons, and introduce other dictatorial measures, which in their totality will amount to the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the victory of socialism, which, however, will by no means immediately purge itself of petty bourgeois slag. Social democracy, we read in the Polish thesis, must utilize the struggle of the young colonial bourgeoisie against European imperialism in order to sharpen the revolutionary crisis in Europe. It is not clear that it is least of all permissible to contrast Europe to the colonies in this respect. The struggle of the oppressed nations in Europe, a struggle capable of going all the way to insurrection and street fighting, capable of breaking down the iron discipline of the army and martial law, will sharpen the revolutionary crisis in Europe to an infinitely greater degree than a much more developed rebellion in a remote colony. A blow delivered against the power of the English imperialist bourgeoisie by a rebellion in Ireland is 100 times more significantly politically important than a blow of equal force delivered in Asia or in Africa. The French chauvinist press recently reported the publication in Belgium of the 8th issue of an illegal journal, Free Belgium. Of course, the chauvinist press of France very often lies, but this piece of news seems to be true. Whereas chauvinist and Kurzgesagt German social democracy has failed to establish a free press for itself during the 2 years of war and has meekly borne the yoke of military censorship. Only the left radical elements, to their credit be it said, have published pamphlets and manifestos in spite of the censorship. An oppressed civilized nation has reacted to a military oppression unparalleled in ferocity by establishing an organ of revolutionary protest. The dialectics of history are such that small nations, powerless as an independent factor in the struggle against imperialism, play a part as one of the ferments, one of the bacilli which helped the real anti-imperialist force, the socialist proletariat, to make its appearance on the scene. The general staffs in the current war are doing their utmost to use any national and revolutionary movement in the enemy camp. The Germans utilized the Irish Rebellion, the French, the Czech movement, etc. They are acting quite correctly from their own point of view. A serious war would not be treated seriously if advantage were not taken of the enemy's slightest weaknesses, and if every opportunity that presented itself were not seized upon. The more so since it is impossible to know beforehand at what moment, where, and with what force some powder magazine will explode. We would be very poor revolutionaries if, in the proletariat's great war of liberation for socialism, we did not know how to utilize every popular movement against every single disaster imperialism brings in order to intensify and extend the crisis. If we were, on the one hand, to repeat in 1,000 keys the declaration that we are opposed to all national oppression, and on the other, to describe the heroic revolt of the most mobile and enlightened section of certain classes in an oppressed nation against the oppressors as a putsch, we should be sinking to the same level of stupidity as the Kortskyites. It is the misfortune of the Irish that they rose prematurely before the European revolt of the proletariat had time to mature. Capitalism is not so harmoniously built that the various sources of rebellion can immediately merge of their own accord, without reverses and defeats. On the other hand, the very fact that revolts do break out at different times in different places and of different kinds guaretees wide scope and depth to the general movement, but it is only in premature, individual, sporadic, and therefore unsuccessful revolutionary movements that the masses gain experience, acquire knowledge, gather strength, and get to know their real leaders, the socialist proletarians, and in this way prepare for the general onslaught, just as certain strikes, demonstrations, local and national, mutinies in the army, outbreaks among the peasantry, etc., prepared the way for the general onslaught in 1905. End of quote. So, to go to some comments on that. First of all, one can see fundamental to Lenin's advocacy is the position he is in, which is a sizable, radical, revolutionary underground socialist movement engaged in the struggle amongst workers, strikes, trade unions, armed struggle, etc., in a condition of secretive, clandestine, and sometimes semi-secretive, semi-clandestine work. So Lenin has authority because he's leading a revolutionary movement. And fundamental to all of his commentary is that there needs to be a revolutionary force that intervenes in these situations. But also Lenin is arguing that it's through basically these historical moments of uprising and direct street actions and class struggle manifested in the streets that a revolutionary process can actually develop. That if people just stand back and then denounce the social conflict, that they're not only not party to a process of developing the revolutionary struggle, but they're actually basically selling out. They're actually becoming counter-revolutionaries, really. So that's why it's important. And what are the parallels to this, perhaps, of more recent times? Perhaps we can say August of 2011, in the 4 days in which the real oppressed working class youth in England rose up against poverty and racism and police brutality sparked and triggered by the police shooting dead of Mark Duggan from the Broadwater Farm estate. Much of the left just denounced that, so saw it as a quote-unquote minority of the kind of the depoliticized, as they saw it, working classes conducting an uprising. However, if the radical left were involved in that uprising, perhaps they could gain more traction amongst a very important social demographic of basically young people being concentrated on council estates. So that perhaps is a historical parallel of more recent times. Hope that's of some interest. We will be sharing more things about Irish revolutionary history and Irish Republican history. So all the best until then.